Okay, so assuming that you were able to set everything up and get the source code running, I figured I'd make another video kind of explaining what it is that's actually in the source code and important things to look for, and maybe even just some of the general structure of the code and how the engine is somewhat structured. But at first, I want to just discuss what the project is trying to do at its current point. So the project is trying to create a client that can imitate the 1299 client. On the server side, that's being done pretty well. So I mentioned in the last video that the server files came from 2Star's leaked Snox project. I think it was a 15xx build or something like that. What I did was, starting with that code, I reverted it back to work with the 1298 packet structure and database files, but I left the Lua script for the questing. One example of what that means is if I go ahead and run the code, so I can run the server here, and this is what you get when this all boots up here is you get the client that's compiling from source. But what I can do is go ahead and close this client, and while the server files are still running, I can jump to what you would expect with the standard sort of 1299 client. So this is actually using the installer and then using the edited exe, the what was it, I believe goat cheese, maybe, I can't remember. But doing it this way, you can launch through the launcher, and right now it's connecting to the source server, and so I can go ahead and start. Oh, one thing that I should mention is before doing this, you need something called Dxtory. I mean, you don't need it, but it is very helpful. What it does is it will cap the frame rate at 60 frames so that you don't have to worry about the login screen burning up your CPU, and also the issue where in Moradon, when you climb up the stairs and fall through, that's you can fix that simply with capping the FPS. And I think in here somewhere there is an option for capping FPS. I don't know. You can Google it. Okay, so anyway, back to the topic at hand. You can start this up, and now you'll see that the leaves aren't flying a million miles an hour because the frame rate is actually capped. So I can use the account bit shift and test because it's actually using the same database. I can go ahead and log in. And this is the binary client, and this is what I refer to quite often as the binary client. I don't mean the compiled version of the client, the version of the client that's compiling from source. I typically call the source client, and this client I normally call the binary client. If that's confusing, can change terminology. I'm indifferent to it, but what this is good for is coding the server files to match what the client expects. This also helps in determining general structure, how the packet should be structured. It was very important for determining what the compression algorithm was that was being used, and various other things. So what you could do if you were interested, you could take the server files here and use them with maybe some 1299 client, and it should be good to go for the most part. One thing that's kind of neat is if you put, I have that client here, I can jump over to my Warfare project. I can start a new instance of this. Let me do this. I can log in. Let's see, let me do testing one. Oh, maybe the testing accounts weren't in that database. 2 stars. That's my fault. Test. So in order to actually show this, I need to log in as non-GM characters, because there's a bug right now that I'm working on with GM visibility. Right now, GMs are always invisible. But what I'm trying to do is on the left, we have the binary version of the client. And on the right, we have the version of the client that's compiling from source. And what's really cool is that since they're both communicating with the same server, the two can see each other when you log in. And that's just kind of, goes to show that things, for the most part, are working. There are certain bugs and there are things that aren't implemented yet, but all in due time. So obviously the binary version of the client is much more stable than the source version, but it gives something to kind of work towards, and it helps in debugging because it gives an idea of like what to expect. So as you can see the 2 players, even though the clients that are being used are different. And the reason this works is simply because the servers are the same. Okay, so that gives you, that's one demonstration of that. Something else that's really cool, so the reverse process also works, and what I mean by that is if I close the server here, stop the debugger, sorry, and I instead start a 1298 server using the binaries. So I'll go ahead and start up the AI server and start up Ebenezer. And the billing server, and Druid, start that. And the login server. Okay, then what I can do is jump back to the code and run simply the client from the debugger and actually connect to the binary server. So this is, as you can imagine, somewhat buggy because the client does have a lot that it's still working on, a lot of bugs still being worked out. But what's interesting is that it does work for the most part. And when you do it this way, what's nice is you get all the quests working as well. So as I'll talk in a little bit, to get the so the quests work using the server compiling from the source code, but you have to individually add each of the quests to the table in the database. And I hope to make a tutorial about that in the future, kind of explaining how that whole process works and how it's possible to convert the EVTs to the Lua files. I think kind of a video about MPC questing and how it works and what the state of it is and what still needs to be done would be interesting. But so you can already see one problem, skill failed to cast for some reason. Although I think if I take the bow off and then attack, yeah, I can attack that way. So I don't know. Plenty of bugs, obviously, but that works as well. And this is really good for setting breakpoints in the client code and then running the binary server, this server, and then kind of doing some debugging that way. So it's possible to debug both ways. You can have the binary server and the source client, or the source server and binary client, and it's really helpful for debugging. And that's the main reason why I've been targeting 1298, because you can do stuff like that pretty simply, and it's made kind of debugging these problems and stuff like that so much easier. So it's nice. Let's see. So next, I kind of want to give a general overview of the code. So here there are 7 projects. The AI server, game server, login server, Lua, and shared are all server-side projects, and the N3 base and warfare are the client-side projects. If you have coded in the KO community in the past, you're probably familiar with server-side work, but you may not be as familiar with the client-side stuff. N3 base is actually the game engine that Not Online runs in, and I've tried my best to kind of separate the N3 base from the actual Not Online game so that it's more like an engine where theoretically you could take it and then write some other sort of MMORPG on top of it. And then this is the Not Online files, a lot of UI files and various sorts of things. But another thing, so that kind of gives you an idea of how the projects work. The N3 base is useful for doing things like rendering text, loading textures, loading meshes, rendering terrain, any kind of like graphic stuff, any kind of 3D math for movement, all these sorts of things. Even the particle system, it's all here, and within the engine itself, animations. Let's see, I think I mentioned the user interface, all the audio stuff. It's all kind of found in here. In the game, you have kind of, it's probably easier to think about the game as being you can break it down in terms of procedures. So you have a general base class called game procedure, and then each procedure that you build within the game, you derive from that class. So for instance, the game proc create character, that's the procedure that you jump in when you go to create your character. Like, you can imagine that you have your login screen, you have your player select screen, player create screen, and then you have the actual like main procedure where the game is happening and stuff. You have 3D stuff, and that's how it is kind of set up in terms of classes as well. You have the base game procedure, you have your login procedure, you have a main procedure, which is a huge file with all sorts of things going on because that's the main. When you log into the game, you log in, you start the main procedure. Character select screen, so you have a character select procedure. Character create, so you have a character create procedure. So on and so forth. Yeah, there's a lot of UI classes for all sorts of particular things. I mean, within any MMO, it's important to have lots of UI. The code in general definitely isn't the cleanest code in the world. It's quite messy, but it's working for the most part. It's somewhat stable, and quite a few big features still need to be implemented. So I can actually jump into the game and talk about this a little bit. So I think the biggest features that are still needing to be implemented would be the Anvil merchant mode. Those are two big ones. Some other things is if you go into the kind of the character sheet where you get all this information, the questing tab where it would list your current quests, that's not implemented. All these other tabs seem to be partially implemented to some extent. The inventory stuff seems to be going well. The skills and skill tree and stuff like that I haven't tested extensively, so that would be worth checking out. I have played around with PvP. It's buggy, but it does work. You can go to Colony Zone and PvP and stuff like that. So yeah, so I think that's sort of general overview. There is also a version of the user interface editor within the source code, and this is compiling from source. The only caveat with that is that you need something like Visual Studio Professional in order to actually compile this, because it requires some of the libraries that communicate with a Windows API. But also right now, what this is doing is this is actually referencing the N3 base project that's in the Night Online solution. So this project here actually spits out a lib file, a library file, and then the user interface editor actually uses that library file. As you can see, even with this line here, load from file, and it's passing a format. This is something that I added. Let's see, you can see it in here. With the assumption being that at some point, we'd want different versions of the file, be able to support different versions of the file so that you could kind of mix and match. And you didn't have to kind of be restricted to just one kind. So what this does is you pass this to the function and it will load a certain type of file. So right now the user interface editor is loading user interface files, UIF files, with the 1298 version, and it's actually writing those files as 1068 UIF files. So this is a way, I've been using that project as a way of converting the 1298 UIFs to 1068. There isn't a big difference between the two, but I didn't want to make the default UIF files for the client 1298 just yet. But yeah, so I think that's basically all there is to talk about, I guess I could mention another project that comes with this is if you go into the server folder, you'll see Evt Converter.zip. If you look into that, this is a program that I wrote that more or less converts the EVT files to Lua script, and it basically just prints out a version of the Lua file that you want. So let's see, this should be, yeah. So this is what these files look like, just lines and lines of stuff. And some of them, when I haven't had time to implement all the execute commands and all of the logic commands, so wherever there's one missing, it will make note of that. And when you're in the game, if you're using the client compiling from source, it'll actually let you know in the info tab that you've encountered, a part of a quest or something that is missing, the logic for it is missing or something like that. So very useful. And this whole file comes from reading this, which actually I don't think that won't do the right thing. Let me open this with Notepad. Okay, so what this program does is it takes this EVT and it reads through this EVT, and then it spits out this huge Lua file. And the idea is that it tries to mimic this as best it can. The only thing that's missing here is the quest helper table in the database, and I'll talk more about that in a future video. If you're interested in this stuff, if there's a particular part of it that you're interested in, please let me know. I'm kind of going to determine what to talk about based on what people are interested in. And if there's no interest, then I will probably just find something to talk about. But I'm sure people will find this stuff interesting. So please feel free to contact me or anything like that.